Chapter 37, Endings and Beginnings, 2-2. Chapter 14, Endings and Beginnings, 2-2, 1998. Percy is 22 and 35, Severus is 37, and both are struggling to adjust to life after war. Percy's reconciliation with his mother does him good, or so Severus decides in the days that follow. He does not outwardly change his behavior, and most of the exhaustion that gathers into dark clouds beneath his eyes continues to press itself into his skin each day. Yet something changes with how Percy holds himself, some loosening of the shoulders or relaxing of the lips, that suggests that speaking with his mother had lifted his burden, at least marginally. Severus is glad. He does not make it a habit to think of his own mother, though in the cookbook that he and Percy have nearly completed, he occasionally comes across a note made in a spiky scrawl, an adjustment to a recipe or an observation. But he can admit with the maturity of a man nearly 40 years old that he would have liked to say goodbye to her at least once. Eileen Prince had done very little for him, but by the same token, she had done everything that she could to shield him from Tobias, smouldering rage, and thunderous bouts of violence. She had taught him the fundamentals of the first-year Hogwarts curriculum in small, furtive bursts of defiance throughout his childhood, so that he easily passed his written tests when he finally arrived. It had proved to be a small blessing, considering that Severus barely had time to study during his first year, given that he had to spend the majority of his time fielding off attacks from his unpleasant housemates who were not particularly inclined to accept a half-blood with a Muggle last name for a peer. Severus still does not know, decades later, whether maintaining his friendship with Lily had made his life easier or more difficult to bear. Certainly during those first few years, where he and Lily were able to meet regularly in the multitude of private places the Hogwarts castle offered to its occupants, he had relied on her friendship, her understanding, her increasingly ludicrous suggestions that he enchant random areas to sleep in rather than returning to his hostel room each night. Severus can still remember her wide-eyed innocence as she tried to convince him to move his things to a broom closet near the base of Gryffindor Tower. Though for all of their subterfuge, neither party had been completely capable of hiding their friendship from their peers, which Severus can now admit caused him a disproportionate amount of retaliation from the Slytherin contingent and the Gryffindors, whereas Lily emerged relatively unscathed. It had been worth it for him, though. It had been worth it to learn how to ward his bed, how to protect his belongings with a dark ritual, how to raise a non-verbal shield and keep it wrapped around his body nearly continuously. It had been worth it to make his excuses to his classmates, to hear their lewd suggestions as to why Severus would often be found in broom closets and abandoned classrooms, to continue partnering with Lily in potions even as Slughorn lavished praise on her for his accomplishments. Lily, for all her strength in charms, was not particularly skilled at the finicky art of potions, but how could Severus begrudge her when he could sit next to her for 2 hours at a time and smell the floral scent of her hair, and have her undivided attention as he painstakingly explained why mixing moonbeams with sunflowers would produce a volatile reaction. And with Halloween just days away, Severus cannot help but think of Lily constantly, to the point that it becomes nearly distracting. For nearly 18 years, Severus had been able to keep his thoughts of Lily under control, allowing himself the painful luxury each night of telling her silently of his day, or occasionally relating to her something that her idiotic son accomplished despite the other half of his gene pool. To James, he told only of Potter's many failures. Lily, your son made the Quidditch team in his first year. Lily, your son battled a basilisk for his friends. Lily, your son sniffed out the mongrel despite a castle of Hogwarts professors attempting to keep him safe. Lily, your son battled the Dark Lord, and he survived not once, but twice. Lily, your son died for us, and I can't hate him anymore, and I don't know what to do without you. Percy's friendship with Potter is as frustrating as it is inexplicable to Severus, who can admit grudgingly that Potter is approaching something resembling maturity, but cannot understand why Percy corresponds with him semi-regularly via owl. It still rankles, somewhere in the back of Severus' mind, that Percy had asked Potter to take him home, that Potter had found him after he disappeared where Severus had not thought it necessary to follow Percy after his flight from the ministry. Severus does not see many similarities between Potter and Percy, and he wishes that Percy spent his time on more productive ventures. So it comes as a surprise when Percy announces that he does not intend to attend the Halloween celebration with his family. Severus had been expecting him to spend most of the day there, leaving him to his own private miseries, and in truth he had been looking forward to an unobserved evening to drink his way steadily to midnight and then stagger upstairs, as was generally his tradition on the Samhain night. Why? Severus asks suspiciously, looking for pity in Percy's guileless face. Percy shrugs. I don't think I have the energy for it, he explains, which has been his standard excuse for anything he does not wish to do. Severus eyes him carefully, but cannot see any other motives hidden behind the glint of Percy's glasses. Your parents did not rescind the invitation, did they? Severus has never particularly liked Marley or Arthur Weasley, though he has never particularly disliked them either, and he remains on alert in case they wield further weapons against their maligned son. Percy shakes his head. No, he confirms, and the barest suggestion of a bashful smile plays at the bow of his lips, as if he remains surprised to hear that his parents wish to associate with him. Severus wants to roll his eyes. He thinks that Percy had forgiven Marley Weasley far too quickly, given her inexcusable distrust of her son. It should have been obvious at least to Marley and Arthur that Percy was acting out of desperation, or at least out of a desire for deception, and Severus does not think that shame is any sort of excuse to avoid speaking to Percy for so many months. The Tonks girl had gathered her courage far earlier than two consummate Gryffindors, and all of the Weasley children besides. But I think the night will center around Harry, and I don't know if I have the energy for it. This explanation is more satisfying to Severus, who cannot imagine a worse fate than to be trapped with the Weasley family and their hanger-ons while Potter reminisced about his parents. But it throws a bit of a wrench into Severus' plans. Though he has seen Percy indulge in the odd hand-mixed cocktail or glass of red wine, he knows that Percy does not approve of heavy drinking and will certainly not be content to leave Severus alone on such an emotionally charged night. Throughout the rest of the day, Severus tries to ensure that they have a normal routine, emphasizing that he is not liable to fall into dripping tears at the first reminder of Lily. He forces them into their customary trip to the shops, and even gives Percy the money for the first time, watching as Percy fumbles his way through the muggle bills. They make their rounds to the small local library, where the librarian, an ancient woman that unfortunately remembers Severus from his youth, smiles warmly at them, as she does each time they enter together, and shows Severus to the collection of science magazines she saves for him. Severus has been taking this opportunity to work his way through a book of Muggle chemistry, a subject he had occasionally referenced but never studied in full, as Percy spends his evenings reading childish novels, such as Aura Adrian. Honestly, Severus does not see the appeal, but Percy has read 4 of the books in the series, and Tobias Greengrass had recently sent him an additional 6 from his personal collection. They, perhaps appropriately, finish his mother's book of French cooking, making the last 2 recipes for lunch and then for supper, and Severus closes the book with some solemnity despite himself. His mother had never cooked any of these recipes for him, though he can remember a few of the desserts if he forces himself to think to his early childhood, and he cannot help but wonder whether the book is a remnant from the early days of her marriage or the final days of her life. Perhaps French cooking was an attempt for a young Eileen to bring refinement into her unexpectedly morose marriage. Tobias, as the young dashing soldier, would have been a far cry from Tobias as the sullen factory worker, a decade later, or an attempt for an older Eileen to harken back to her pure-blooded past after Tobias' death during Severus' 6th year. The Prince family had been a family of some renown, once. Perhaps Eileen had dined on these dishes and once entertained thoughts of feeding them to her son. Thanks for sharing these recipes with me, says Percy gravely, who must be under the impression that these are the dishes of Severus' youth, and their cooking them together was an activity of great import. It provided me with an opportunity to correct your poor cooking skills, Severus responds coolly, to forestall any further emotional declarations, but Percy only grins at him as if the insult barely had any effect. Severus is finding it increasingly difficult to pass Percy's moods, to see if he continues to linger in depression or angry, purposeful resolution, or whether he is mimicking the more cheerful boy he had once been before. Tom Severus does not know whether Percy's ability to slide smoothly between these extremes is positive. It seems as if it ought to be better than the early days, where Percy spent most of the days firmly mired in depression, or negative. If Severus ought to do anything other than respond in kind when he can. Whether Severus remains mired in depression is a topic he does not dwell on. At times, he too feels unfettered, a lightness in his stomach, like when Percy begins to cheerfully tease him about his own ingredient preparation, though at other times he feels like his feet are made of lead, as they do when he walks to the parlor after supper and settles in his chair without a glass of wine at his side. But Percy surprises him. He leaves the parlor for just long enough for Severus to conclude that Percy has tactfully left Severus alone for the remainder of the evening, but then returns with a crystal decanter of amber liquid, a fine whiskey, judging from the smell when Percy carefully extracts the top, and 2 glasses. "The minister," says Percy in response to Severus' brief quizzical look, "and the decanter set is from Yaxley, if you can believe it." Not quite the done gift, but either he thought I wouldn't know better, or he didn't know better. "I did not know that you were in contact with Corbin Yaxley," Severus says, with a small, private frown, as Percy carefully measures out 2 generous portions of the whiskey. Severus is pleased to note that even without magic, Percy can measure by feel a precise number of ounce, though he watches quizzically as Percy nearly tops off each glass. Perhaps Percy is more in line with Severus' original plans for the evening than Severus had thought, though Severus does not trust Percy not to kill himself in an attempt to keep up with Severus' ability to consume large quantities of alcohol, honed over nearly 4 decades of life. Severus feels more displeased than he ought to hear that Percy is reconnecting with some of his less savory companions, though with Corbin's elevation to self-proclaimed protector of the savior of the wizarding world, Severus supposes such a relationship is not publicly unacceptable. Whether Percy ought to be corresponding with Corbin is another issue altogether. Percy carries the glasses gingerly over to Severus, handing one over and then setting the other carefully on top of a coaster that he balances over the books that he continues not to read. Severus has long since decided not to press the issue, choosing to view their continued presence next to Percy's chair as a minor victory, but he eyes the balanced glass with a disapproving expression, though Percy has never displayed the proclivity for knocking things over that several of his siblings possessed in ample measure. Ginevra and William had been the best, after Percy, at potions, though neither seemed to possess a proper appreciation for the art. "I thought we may toast to Lily," Percy says, his voice hitching slightly on the name. Severus observes the flush prickling his neck and lower cheeks and hopes his own face is not betraying the turmoil that immediately erupts at a name said in his voice. "And Regulus, and Lucius, if you'd like. And to your friend, Landon Greengrass," Severus adds quietly. Percy flinches at the name but nods solemnly, his eyes bright behind his glasses. Something that Severus has never grown accustomed to with Percy is his ease with tears, how unashamed he is to show his emotions. Tobias Snape would have ground his son into the dirt before allowing him to cry openly, but Severus does not find the hint of tears gathering in Percy's eyes to be as unmanly as his father would have, had he seen it. "Auntie Muriel and Andromeda taught me a toast of honor," Percy says, rising with his glass to face the fireplace, which crackles and pops agitatedly in front of them as if sensing his intentions. "So I cannot say which of the old ways it follows. That they agreed on it suggests to me that it is common to both sides, which I think may be appropriate for this night." Severus inclines his head, joining Percy so that they stand, shoulder by shoulder, warmed only by their shared presence and the flickering flames. Percy straightens, holding out his glass, and begins to speak in confident, ringing Latin, his lips forming the words as if he regularly conversed in Latin rather than English. It sends a shiver down Severus' spine to hear Percy's voice take on its formal, ancient cadence, and though they are in a muggle home and toasting without magic, Severus feels the hair on the back of his neck rise, as if they were in the presence of the ancient magic in the caves. His magic hisses and swirls around him, responding to the change in the atmosphere as Percy continues, calling upon the gods of old to honor the sacrifices of their compatriots, to bless their passage into the afterworld, to bring vengeance upon their enemies and justice upon their families. Severus has never been educated in the old ways, though he taught himself Latin somewhere between his third and fourth year at Hogwarts, but the words feel familiar to him, right, as if calling to some instinct in his breast, the baying of dogs after a golden horn, the exultant cry of an army on the crashing shore of an ancient beach, the solemn, persistent chanting of a circle of warlocks with their arms raised to the heavens. And then Percy begins to chant the names of the dead in a soft, gentle tone, so that the shiver building on the back of Severus' neck slithers down his spine. He speaks their full names, and it clenches something inside Severus' stomach to hear Lily Josephine Evans Potter, to know that Percy had researched Lily's middle name for the purpose of this toast. The image that comes into Severus' head now is not that of horns or soldiers or heroes, but of the soft, quiet light of a moon shining over a sleeping field, each blade of grass coated in molten silver, though it has been many years since Severus had cause to pause and notice the grass underfoot. "Now we pour the whiskey into the fire," says Percy quietly, his fingers tightening on the glass. In the reflection of the refracted crystal shapes, the deep glow of the flames seemed to engulf Percy's hand, and Severus feels his own fingers begin to burn in sympathy. As a sacrifice to those who are no longer with us, we may ask for a wish for them as we do so, something to soothe their souls wherever they may be. Severus swallows. To give a wish to Lily, wherever she is, to sum up the riotous turmoil in his heart. He is almost pathetically grateful when Percy steps forward and begins to pour his glass into the flames, the thin stream of liquid steaming as it hits the crackling logs, sending the spiced scent into the air. For Landon Tobias Greengrass, I wish for him that he finds permanence in the world after this, Percy intones quietly as the fire swells around his offering. He pulls the glass back to his body, and Severus notices that some of the whiskey remains, swirled at the bottom of the glass. Severus clears his throat and steps forward, modulating the stream of whiskey so that he too would have some left over, in case there was a secondary part of the ritual that Percy had not revealed. For Regulus Arcturus Black, I wish for him that he finds recognition in the world after this, Severus says, thinking of the boy that he had once known with flashing grey eyes and an impish smile, so desperate to prove himself that he joined, and then betrayed the Dark Lord. To Lucius Abraxas Malfoy, I wish for him that he finds refinement in the world after this. Lucius would smirk at that if he could hear it, which feels an appropriate way to honor him. Then, his mouth dry, Severus forces himself to continue, turning his thoughts to Lily and the warmth of her smile, and how cold she had been when he had found her, how her gleaming red hair had looked like blood in the candlelight of the room. And for Lily Josephine Evans Potter, I wish for her that she may find peace in the world after this. To his horror, Severus feels his own eyes begin to fill with tears, though he has of course not cried since that last horrid Halloween, since he had realized the depths of his failures, that he had come to terms with the fact that he had killed his best friend, based on nothing more than his own hurt pride and his own terrible arrogance, that Albus had promised to save her, and yet let her die, so that the boy may live, and the Dark Lord may be defeated. But he does not regret what he had said. Lily had been many things in life, but she had never been at peace, something that Severus sees in her son, in his constant need to seek out entertainment or struggle or absolution. Lily had hungered for more, for better things, for a new future, and she had never gotten it, because he had stolen all of her futures from her and left her to die in a cold, empty house. Percy steps forward again, and Severus takes the opportunity to angrily blink away the tears. His own voice steady, Percy looks into the fire and says, "And to Tom Marvolo Riddle, I wish for him that he may find freedom in the world after this." When Percy turns to face Severus, as he steps back from the fire, his glass now emptied, Severus is silenced by the same look of sorrow that he feels reflected in his own face. by the boundless understanding that gleams between them more brightly than the fire that still dances at their feet. It shocks Severus, and it strengthens him, and he finds himself stepping forward before he can regret what he is doing, and pouring the last of his offering into the flames, as he says in a voice barely audible. And for Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, I wish for him that he may find happiness in the world after this. And when Severus turns back to Percy, he views him through eyes blurred with tears, and he finds that he cannot feel embarrassed, not with the heat of the fire and the warmth of Percy's gaze. Though Severus does not allow the tears to fall, when he goes to bed, hours later, sober save for a single glass of the whiskey, he finds that his throat and chest are loosened, as if he had released the sob that had lingered half-caught in his throat for the rest of the evening. December 1990, nothing outwardly changes between Percy and Severus, after Percy dared to presume that Severus would appreciate his efforts to toast the dead, except that Percy feels cautiously confident that Severus had appreciated his efforts, and that knowledge seems to change everything. It changes things for Percy, at least, who finds himself able to relax just marginally in Severus' presence. The knowledge that his mother does not hate him, and that his old professor is at least somewhat interested in having him as her student, and that even Severus had thawed by the heat of the fire. All of these accomplishments crackle and pop inside Percy's breast and loosen some of the ashes caked into his throat. The first time that he teases Severus, unable to prevent himself from laughing at the expression on Severus' face when Percy catches him with one of Landon's adventure books, he tenses immediately after, waiting for Severus to purse his lips and sweep angrily from the room. Yet after only a mere second's hesitation, Severus gives a rueful shrug and returns imperiously to the novel, concentrating on it intently, which Percy rules as a victory. Percy takes one of his potions journals in exchange and finds to his surprise that he is still fascinated by potions, to the point where 2 hours drop away and both men are still embroiled in their opposite reading material. Percy relaxes, and perhaps living in Severus' house is an advanced form of tutelage, for as he relaxes it seems so does Severus. But Percy cannot entirely relax as November trundles its way toward December and the inevitable conclusion of this strange, unprecedented year. McGonagall's offer, not yet given, at least not in person, echoes in his head, as well as the almost guilty realization that as each passing day is coated by a light dusting of contentedness, Percy finds that within him he is hungering for something more. It is not Severus. In fact, when Percy thinks of the coming months, he finds it very hard, if not impossible, to imagine any sort of life without Severus, or at least without Severus' snarky humor and long-suffering support. It is not Severus that makes his life feel so small. Following his perusal of the potions journals, Percy begins to debate theory again with Severus, and those days fill him with a shade of his old fierce exultant joy, when he would attend tutelage grimly determined to succeed at the task that Severus had set for him, and each concession from his professor would fill him with pleased joy. It is not the neighborhood either, nor the muggles. Percy has found, after over 9 months living among them, that the muggles are not very different from any of the foreign wizards that he had met, and in some ways are more similar to him than they. Certainly half of their conversations at the shops mean nothing to Percy, as if they are speaking a separate language only nominally related to English, and their accents are different both to the posh pureblood tones of the Malfoys and the cheerful country drawl of the Diggories. Yet Percy quite likes many of the muggles he's met, and from what he has gleaned of their culture, they are living rich and complex lives, containing a dizzying quantity of references to topics that Percy can barely begin to understand, and dealing with political issues and fiscal insecurity of their very own. But at the same time, Percy cannot entertain the thought of doing anything else. Lately, even dragging himself out of the house to see Tonks, or Bill, or even his parents is exhausting, truly exhausting, so that when he returns it is all he can do to drag himself into bed. But he is tired of sleeping, and he is tired of doing nothing, so that he at times feels trapped between the two impulses, his body slowly being flattened by his twin desires. To instead return to Hogwarts as a new type of student, to be so close to the magic that used to be his birthright. Would he be able to bear it? Percy has not become accustomed to his lack of magic, but he has been able to prevent himself from lingering on it. But such an act would be impossible in a castle brimming with magic, even if Percy were able to overcome the memories that Hogwarts still evokes for him, that at times weave themselves into his nightmares. Myrtle would be there, and McGonagall and Cedric, but so would the basilisk, slithering underneath the ground. Percy would speak to Severus about his dilemma, but though Percy has relaxed, and Severus has in turn, there is a strange undercurrent to Severus' actions, as if he were concealing a still and quiet ocean that nevertheless would drag an intruder into the depths without mercy. Severus returns to Percy his linked notebook, which Percy takes with a frown, as if Severus wished to imply that he would have no need to speak to Percy if he were to go to Hogwarts. He makes a bundle of galleons without being asked, and provides them to Percy in a sturdy dragon-leather pouch, enough galleons for Percy to remain at Hogwarts for a year without braving Gringotts for funds. And in what seems like the worst offense to Percy, Severus repairs his old Hogwarts trunk, which had been sitting, miniaturized, at the foot of Percy's bed for many months, and offers in a neutral tone to discard anything that Percy may no longer find useful. "I haven't decided that I'm going," snaps Percy at this last. The sight of his old cherished Hogwarts trunk an abrupt and unwelcome interruption into the quiet solitude of his afternoon. Severus' face seems to indicate that he considers it a foregone conclusion that Percy would accept McGonagall's offer, and Percy opens and closes his mouth fruitlessly, unable to articulate why he would not want to return to the hallowed halls of learning that for many years had been his only refuge. "You will." Severus' assumption rankles Percy, who draws himself up and spits out, "If you do not want me here, then you ought to say so, plainly, instead of resorting to measures such as these." "You may stay here as long as you wish," Severus responds evenly, "but you ought to make your decision carefully, Percy. An apprenticeship with Minerva would smooth many of the paths in your way that threaten to be dangerous." Percy knows what Severus means, and though Severus does not believe him, he is not as offended at the idea of McGonagall's pity as everyone would expect. Percy does not have magic, and therefore he will not be able to study further at a university after his apprenticeship, nor teach at an institution, nor practice in any way what he proposed. Yet McGonagall is very well respected in her field, and her sponsorship of him could help in many ways. Still, something sticks in his throat and makes him unable to say out loud what Severus seems to expect, that he will return to Hogwarts, and both of them will be once again alone. This December is a mild one, with wan winter sunlight streaming through Percy's windows. He still has not bought curtains, so that he wakes with the sun each morning, though he often lingers in bed for several hours, watching as the colors of the sky go through their slow, melting dance toward daytime. And Percy cannot shake the feeling that the year has already ended, and spring has begun to sprout out of the barren brown ground. It is as if the weather is taunting him, to inform him crisply that the rest of the world has moved beyond their gusts of stormy weather, and he could luxuriate in the warmth of the sun if he only could bring himself to go outside. And so when McGonagall requests Severus assistance at the end of term to bolster the wards after the students have left the castle, Percy contemplates remaining home again. If he sees McGonagall, McGonagall will force the issue, and Percy still does not know what to say. And at last, he shakes his head and forces himself to stand. He cannot speak about his feelings with Severus, not with Severus in the strange, brittle mood, as if Percy is choosing to go off and die and never speak to him again. Why ought he prevent himself from speaking to McGonagall? Only minutes after they arrive in McGonagall's office, Severus excuses himself and stalks from the room, his face set in a forbidding scowl. Percy watches him go, feeling chastised, which of course is ridiculous. Severus ought to be happy that Percy came along and is confronting his future, not upset at him. "So," McGonagall says, her voice carefully neutral, "may I ask how living with Severus is going?" For a second, Percy bristles, but when he glances up to McGonagall, he spots humor in her eyes, and he allows himself to relax and smile. "Trying," he admits dryly. "Severus seems to be quite upset at me of late. I think he wants me to leave, but cannot figure out how to tell me." Severus is an intensely private man, McGonagall agrees, and Percy tries to ignore the sight of Dumbledore pretending to sleep instead of listening. It is a marvel he allowed you into his home at all. Percy wants to say something, but he can't quite figure out what it is, so he only shrugs and responds. He's been very welcoming, all things considered, but I don't blame him for wanting his own privacy again. Yet doesn't he blame Severus? Isn't he angry at how clearly Severus wishes to say goodbye? Percy wrenches his mind away forcefully from the thought. He will not think of saying goodbye to Severus until it is necessary, until he has made his decision more fully. Speaking of privacy, says McGonagall with a touch of irony, and Percy smirks at the ripple of discontent on Dumbledore's painted face. I thought we might move to my old office. Are you still the head of Gryffindor House? For now, McGonagall says, standing and shepherding them out of the door and down the spiral staircase. There is not an eligible Gryffindor among the professors, if you can believe it. Perhaps too many Gryffindors of that age had been killed in the last war. Percy cannot help but think, mentally roving through the list of professors as they walk to McGonagall's office at the base of Gryffindor Tower. There are certainly far more Ravenclaws and Slytherins on the staff, though that could perhaps be attributed to differences in career goals. Most of Percy's housemates had not been particularly keen on their own lessons, let alone on teaching others. Her office looks very much the same as Percy remembers, though of course it has been many years since he had last seen the light slanting through the windows. He finds himself relaxing immediately as he takes his seat in front of her desk. I can't find another Transfiguration professor that I would trust to take over, McGonagall huffs as she hunts for a packet of ginger biscuits. Dawlish applied, if you can believe it. I had to tell him that the students are not likely to accept his leadership, not after the fiasco with Dolars. His 10 outstandings be damned. Percy smiles distractedly, but does not respond. His attention has been caught by the large rectangular window to his right. It is an enchanted window, so for most of his time at Hogwarts, it had been centered on the Quidditch pitch, either for McGonagall's own amusement or so that she can keep an eye on the injury-prone practices. But she has since focused it on the problematic boundary of the wards, where Percy can just make out Severus following an invisible path, his eyes tracking some output of a spell that Percy cannot see. Severus stalks toward the same copse of trees in the forbidden forest as before, the waving branches of the Whomping Willow only a few meters away. Percy can tell by the savage way that Severus's small figure is digging his feet into the ground with each step that he is still upset. Mr. Weasley, McGonagall says crisply, as if he were 11, and his attention snaps back to her. He finds himself straightening obediently. The familiar scent of ginger biscuits and strongly brewed tea only add to the illusion that he is 17 again and waiting for her to review his latest proposal. Thank you for accompanying Severus today. I know that returning to Hogwarts can be a trial for you. Severus mentioned that you wish to speak to me, Percy says politely but firmly. He has had quite a long time to think through McGonagall's proposal, and though he still feels seized around the middle with indecision, he thinks he is ready at least to hear from her what she may think, so that he may make his decision with open eyes. McGonagall nods approvingly. As Severus may have implied, I have a proposition for you, and I ask that you not dismiss it out of hand. She hesitates, and then looks at him solidly in the eyes. I wish for you to return to Hogwarts and complete an apprenticeship under my supervision. I am asking you to consider this for 3 reasons. The first, that I genuinely believe that your insights into the field of transfiguration and soul-based magic are novel and have the potential to push the field forward tremendously. The second, that I think returning to Hogwarts in scholarship would provide you a sense of closure and opportunity to heal. And the third, that completing a Hogwarts apprenticeship will open doors for you that would otherwise remain closed. Percy's first reaction is the flare-up of singed pride that immediately urges him to protest that he does not need pity nor a safe place to heal. His second reaction is more muted, and he shakes his head in rueful relief to hear it all laid out so plainly. Of course, McGonagall thinks he has something academically of value. She would not have given him an offer initially if she did not think he had insights worth sharing. But of course she would not renew her offer without cause, as Percy had told Severus, and she was in her own way offering him a gift, To be honest, Professor, I do not know what I want to do, Percy admits, as he ought to have 5 years prior, sitting in this same classroom on a warm day near the end of term. Her blink of surprise informs him that she had been expecting more of an outburst, and Percy is relieved despite himself that Severus had revealed her intentions so early, so that he was able to process his feelings over a matter of months rather than seconds. I appreciate the offer tremendously and do not mean to spurn it, but at the same time, I find myself entertaining certain reservations with returning to Hogwarts. There are ghosts within these halls, agrees McGonagall, her eyes surprisingly understanding, and more too immortalized in the portraits upon our walls. I understand your hesitation, Mr. Weasley, but I can assure you that with time you will be comfortable within the castle once more. It's not that. Is my offer itself not to your liking? McGonagall leans forward, the scent of tea curling between them. Mr. Weasley, I assure you that I am genuine when I say that I believe your work could have an impact on our society. No, it's not that either, explains Percy, as fruitlessly now as in his own mind. He hesitates, looking at his august professor, and says plaintively, "This is everything I've ever wanted, Professor. I don't have my magic, and I would be lying to say that I'm not concerned about completing an apprenticeship without it, but that isn't it either." "Percy, you may speak plainly, and you may call me Minerva if you dare," McGonagall says quietly, and Percy smiles without humor. He would speak plainly if he could untangle the confusion in his mind and identify the truth. "I have long considered myself your mentor, and I would be happy to help you think through this decision. You need not give me an answer today." "I'm tired," Percy admits, and he wants to sag into the chair and dissolve into the floor. He glances out of the window, which is still trained on Severus far below, a tiny figure examining the colorful output of a spell in silence. This is what he cannot say to Severus, who even in peace is often brimming with energy and focus and direction, but Percy finds it easier to say to McGonagall, who had always been for him a beacon of support. "I don't know if I want to study anything, regardless of the subject. I've been reading children's books, Professor." He shakes his head, avoiding her eyes, continuing to watch as Severus draws magic from the ground. "I can't do magic, and I think I've come to the point where I could study it without feeling bereft, or at least without feeling hopeless. But I can't imagine coming to Hogwarts and then waking up every day and completing a course of study and being a student again. I can't do it. I can't do anything at all, but I'm so tired of feeling exhausted." McGonagall sighs, a mournful sort of sigh, and when Percy looks back to her, he sees to his surprise that she looks very much as if she feels the same exhaustion that has been weighing down his every movement, as if dragging his bones prematurely toward the ground. "You need not do anything at all, my boy," she says, and Percy blinks at the term of endearment, which he has never heard from McGonagall. Even his given name is still unfamiliar from her lips, and he would have thought that he'd imagined my boy if he had not seen the sorrowful downward tilt to her pale, wrinkled lips. "You may rest, if that is indeed what you wish." "But I can't rest for the rest of my life," says Percy in a small voice, feeling his stomach squeeze painfully with the desire to do precisely that. "You once asked me to believe you if you came to me with an unbelievable story," McGonagall says quietly, and Percy tenses at once at the unfamiliar edge in her tone. "You have not come to me with that story, Percy, but I have learned it nevertheless, and I understand why you could not confide in me earlier. But please trust that I have a glimpse into the greater picture when I speak, and I ask you to heed me as your mentor and your professor, and the woman who has had the delight of seeing you mature into a capable and fine young man. You do not owe anything to anyone any more, Percy Weasley. You do not owe anything to your family, nor to your peers, nor to Harry Potter, nor even to Severus Snape, and certainly not to me." I don't understand what you are saying, Professor," Percy says uneasily, his neck prickling as he processes the insistent brightness to her eyes. Had his mother told McGonagall of his secret? Had Severus? Did she know that he had traveled through time, or was she just referring to a smaller portion of the greater picture that she had alluded to? When McGonagall leans forward again, he sees suddenly a hint of the soldier within her that he had seen from Severus, and even from Flitwick, back in the early days, when he had told the class solemnly of his experience wielding defensive charms in the First Wizarding War, and from Dumbledore more than once. He had seen the hint of this same tough steel in his mother, who had protected 7 children from war the best she could, and from Tonks, who could wield her wand more capably than most wizards that Percy had ever met, and from Myrtle, who for all her youthful exterior was a soul older than even he. I am saying that you have lived your life according to the rules that you set to yourself at 11, and to a task that you had that was far too great for one individual, McGonagall says precisely and deliberately, and Percy feels the impulse to rise and flee well up inside him. He squeezes together his toes, trying to keep his expression carefully blank, but it is difficult to face the raw honesty of his former professor without emotion. What did she know? What did others know? It made him feel exposed, and frightened and claustrophobic and desperate. Professor. And then McGonagall smiles, and Percy feels that his throat no longer feels as tight, and he is able to breathe again at the warm understanding in her eyes. You have a third life left to live, she says gently, and he bites his lip fiercely. So she knew whether his mother had told her or Severus, and she too is not fleeing at the sight of him, nor clamoring to have him locked away for his sins. And I sense you do not know what you wish to do with it, and I admit I hope that you return to Hogwarts. But you must do what you feel will make you happy, Percy. That is the greatest bravery I can ask of you, to make a choice for your own happiness and have conviction in it. Percy's voice hitches when he asks, but what if I choose wrong? Then you choose again, and you choose differently. McGonagall looks out the window too, and he follows her gaze, and they together in silence watch the straight lines of Severus body as he paces back and forth, muttering to himself as he works out something complex in his mind. It will be the hardest thing you have done, but you must learn to trust yourself and to forgive yourself for your mistakes if you are to move past this, Percy. For a very long time they are silent, and Percy finds his attention caught on Severus. Severus is rushing through his spells. Percy can see his haste in the swift, abrupt lines of his wand work, and he has the sudden thought that perhaps Severus is hurrying so that he may return home before Percy, so that he can be perfectly composed by the fireplace to hear what Percy has to say. But Percy still does not know what to say. He feels caught between these options, the great old grandeur of Hogwarts and everything it has represented for him in all of the realms his soul has lived, and the quiet domestic solitude of Severus' house, which has felt more like a home than anywhere else he had ever lived, at least in this lifetime. How can he explain to anyone that where the idea of returning to Severus' house makes him feel understandably small and confined, and in a strange way disappointed with himself, the idea of returning to Hogwarts makes him inexplicably feel the very same way? A glint in the window catches his eye, and Percy watches as a droplet from an overhead pipe catches on the ridge of the window and rolls down the pane before the magic catches it and fizzles it away. Perhaps Myrtle would understand that Percy cannot help, but neither of these options feel like a life at all, or at least a life where he would be happy. He cannot recall the last time that he was truly happy. He had never been happy with Tom, at least not without the corresponding anxiety seizing the outline of his heart. He had never been happy at Hogwarts, at least not for more than a few minutes at a time, not without the burden of the upcoming war in the back of his mind at all times. And he certainly had never been happy at the Burrow, not with that constant tension between him and his family, his sense that something about him does not belong fully. What does it even mean for him to be happy? How would he recognize it when it came? If he could peer into his soul again, Percy clutches at the stone, even as his eyes track Severus as he pauses in his movements and glances up at the castle, as if sensing Percy's attention. Would it still be Hogwarts, or the river bank, or somewhere else entirely? Would it help him understand his happiness, what his soul longs for, the rift that he had torn with his own hands? If he does not know what it feels like to be happy, how can he have conviction in whatever choice he made? Is Severus leaving? McGonagall asks, breaking into Percy's attention, and with a jolt he sees that Severus has stowed his wand and begun to walk across the grounds, but not in the direction of the great hall. He is walking toward the large iron gates, which would swing open at his touch and admit him into Hogwarts. He couldn't have finished the repairs in such a short amount of time. He's leaving without me, Percy says, and with a flash he realizes that the brittleness he'd sensed from Severus ever since that Halloween night was because Severus had been forcing himself to say goodbye but had not been pleased to do so. It had felt so alien to Percy because Severus was fond of him, perhaps even cared for him. Hadn't he said such a thing to Percy under duress? Severus has been saying goodbye, equipping Percy with a notebook, galleons, and trunk to begin his apprenticeship, not because he wishes for Percy to leave, but because he believes that he is helping Percy to do the right thing, the bloody idiot. Percy had never asked for his help, for anything other than quiet peace and support, but Severus never had been able to resist sticking his large nose into areas of Percy's life that did not concern him. The difference is that now, watching his painfully small figure cross the grounds, Percy thinks for the first time that perhaps Severus interferes in his life because he cares for Percy, perhaps because they are friends. And this, more than anything else, flares brightly in his breast and induces him to leap to his feet. Percy turns back to McGonagall, who looks the very same as she always has, though more tired, perhaps, and more old, and says urgently, as if the brief moment of clarity that Severus, departing body, had brought upon him could disappear at any time. I don't want either of these things, Professor. McGonagall frowns at him. What is holding you back, Percy? Absolutely nothing. Percy shakes his head, and an incredulous laugh threatens to bubble out of his tight chest. I can't stay here, Professor, and I can't go back either. He pauses, expecting another question, but McGonagall has closed her mouth and is watching him quietly. Under her gaze he straightens, feeling for the first time in her office like he is not merely 11, and that he perhaps could one day be her equal. With a shy yet defiant shrug, he continues, I've never lived past this point, not in either tea timeline, and I have no idea what it is that I want. But I know what I don't want. And that is, Professor McGonagall asks archly, raising an eyebrow. To die as if I've never lived, says Percy, and he thinks of Myrtle, of her smile, of her persistence in growing and changing, even after death. It gives him the strength to admit, Professor, I feel nervous to say no to you, but by the same token, I do not feel afraid. Good, says McGonagall fiercely, standing as well, her tea and cookies left uneaten. You deserve to say no to things, Percy. I want a new arena entirely, he says, shaking his head, and the minute that the words leave his mouth, he realizes that they are true. To return to Hogwarts a third time, to live his life again as if he could rewrite it for a third time, to waste away the rest of his life afraid to even read a book, hesitant to wake before dawn and greet the world as he had with Auntie Muriel in the summer solstice. I wish to be free, he thinks to himself, and something inside him burns at the thought. And then without another thought, he's running, as if he were once again a lynx, his four paws bounding while his heart strains in primordial joy. He skids down the 5 flights of stairs from McGonagall's office to the great hall, the stairs swinging swiftly and creakily to meet him so that he need not break his stride. He bursts through a crowd of ghosts, who scatter in the sunlight like spray at the banks of a stream, and leaves them behind to their affronted muttering as he turns the corner and runs out into the courtyard. After so many months of inactivity, his chest burns with the effort, but he forces himself to continue, albeit at a slower pace, feeling acutely that if Severus walks out of Hogwarts without him today, some spell between them will be broken, and Percy will never be able to say the things that are sprouting in his chest. Down across the grounds, with Hagrid's hut to the left, a hippogriff in his garden lifting its head curiously as Percy passes. Down past the Whomping Willow, to skid right onto the small path that Severus had taken. Across past the Forbidden Forest, the tall hoops of the Quidditch pitch just visible across the grounds. Up past the hill where Percy had fainted in his first year from trying to summon boulders. And then the gates of Hogwarts are in sight, and Percy puts on a final burst of speed, his heart beating and straining out of his chest, and he thinks to himself exultantly there, like he is his lynx, and he has scented his target, and his world has narrowed to only his goal, and he nearly barrels into Severus, who turns with a spell already on his lips, thick ropes that bind Percy and throw him to the ground. What in Merlin's name are you doing? Severus roars at him, looming over him angrily. Is there some sort of emergency that required you to tackle me like a bloody rugby player? Painfully, Emma shed in the robes. Percy blinks owlishly at Severus from the ground and chokes out, "Rugby player." "A muggle sport," explains Severus with a glower. He looks for a second, as if he might consider leaving Percy trussed up like a Christmas turkey on the wet grass, but then releases Percy reluctantly and watches dispassionately as Percy pushes himself up to his feet. Massaging his arms, Percy scowls at Severus. He hates that bloody spell. "You were leaving," Percy explains shortly, all of his thrilled joy leaving his body as Severus regards him, unimpressed. When Severus does not speak, Percy continues, his cheeks beginning to flood with hot, heavy blood. "Without me." Severus raises an eyebrow. "I can send you your things." I'm not staying, Severus." Percy briefly squeezes his eyes together in frustration, needing a second to take stock of his body, and the sweat lining his brow and gathering between his armpits and the tired stutter of his heart. It had felt good to run, though Percy had never been one for exercise, to tear across the grounds without any thought beyond reaching Severus as quickly as possible. "You are not happy in my house." Percy wipes the back of his sleeve against his forehead, feeling that uncomfortable mix of being hot on a cold day. One reason he had preferred to stay inside during the drafty winter months of Scotland. "I'm not," he agrees simply, and because he is watching for it, he catches the surprised flinch before Severus blinks away the expression. Percy would like to think through why it is that everyone expects him to react so emotionally all the time, but he is afraid that if he does start thinking through that question, he will come to some disappointing truths. "But you're not either, Severus. Do not presume to know my happiness. I may not know your happiness, but I do know you, Severus," Percy says firmly, and he has the satisfying experience of seeing Severus' jaw snap shut. "You are no happier in your house than I am." Severus nearly bares his teeth as he hisses, "I am content with how my life is proceeding." "Are you?" Percy mimics Severus' expression from earlier, raising a mocking eyebrow. "You said that you came to Hogwarts expecting it to be the last time." "You were ready to die, Severus, all the same as I was, and yet here I am, alive." Percy gives Severus his best Lucius smile, his teeth pressed together, glinting brightly in the sun. "And I were to leave you, could you tell me in good faith that you will continue to be, after you realize again how utterly miserable you are?" That Severus draws his wand on Percy should not have come as a surprise to Percy, and he adjusts to the new threat easily, though he of course could not parry Severus' spells should he choose to deploy them. What does come as a surprise to Percy is the raw anger in Severus' dark, unfathomable eyes. Percy presses forward, sensing instinctively that perhaps in Severus' shock, he will be able to listen to Percy's words more clearly. "You did not live in that decade between the First War and the Second. Take it from me, Severus. I know what it looks like when someone is merely going through the motions because they feel they have no other option. And in the war, you claim I was living as Albus, murderer and Hogwarts' most hated professor." Percy shrugs, his eyes coolly holding Severus' gaze. "You were not happy, but I would guess that at least you had a purpose which helped. You dare lecture me on topics of which you know nothing. Do I know nothing, Severus?" Percy asks challengingly, and Severus falls silent, his chest heaving and his fingers tight around his wand. "You may lie to everyone else, but I would thank you not to lie to me. I think we owe each other that much, don't we?" The wind whistles wetly around them, and Percy pulls his robes tighter around his body, the patches on his robes where he had fallen damp and uncomfortable. Severus flicks his wand, and Percy tenses, but he had cast only a drying and a warming spell, and Percy nods his head in thanks. "Say what it is that you wish to say, and then leave me be," says Severus finally, his voice flat and hard. It is a striking difference from the rich, knowing tones that Percy associates most closely with his old professor, and Percy finds his face softening as he turns it toward the other man. "I want to leave Britain." The thought had formed high in the confines of Gryffindor Tower and strengthened during his run to the Hogwarts gate, so that it now emerges confidently from his mouth. "I want to go to France and pay my respects to Landon in the place where he gave his life for the war, and then I want to go somewhere else." Percy shrugs helplessly, thinking of the mischievous glint in Myrtle's eyes. "I want to eat proper French food that we didn't muddle through making ourselves. I want to drink some wine and see if I like it more when it's made by the Muggles. I want to go to a library and not research dark magic. I want to see the pyramids again, or the dragons in Romania, or something else entirely. I do not even know what I want to see because I do not know anything about the world other than this. You wish to leave, Severus says dubiously, and Percy nods, an incredulous laugh bubbling out of his throat. Why not? What is keeping us here, Severus? Percy gestures to the familiar grounds of the castle and the tall, graceful towers gleaming in the afternoon light. Hogwarts isn't going anywhere, and neither of us belong here anyway. You can leave your house for a year, and nobody is going to claim it as theirs. Nobody needs anything from us. Severus stares at Percy as if he were speaking a foreign language. You wish to spend your freedom to travel. The admonishment that such a thing would be far too frivolous to justify goes unsaid, but not unheard. Yes, Percy affirms, still with that strange, effervescent feeling of wanting to laugh, that childish giddiness that he has not felt in many years. Who cares what we do any more, Severus? So I lost my magic. So I have half a soul. So you must grapple with what you did to help us win the war. We can do those things as easily in another country. Severus takes a step forward and says gravely, "But we must pay our repentance, Percy, for the sins we committed." "Haven't we already?" Percy insists pleadingly, and Severus falls silent, staring at Percy with bewildered puzzlement. In a softer tone, feeling some of the giddiness leave his system, Percy continues, "I've lost my magic, Severus. You've lost all of your friends and those you loved, and your job as a professor. Neither of us belong here anymore." "You may go, Percy, if you feel this is what you need to heal," says Severus with an air of finality. "But I cannot abandon my own repentance so easily. It is our choices that determine our impact on the world, Severus," Percy says desperately as Severus turns to go. "Isn't that what you and I have both learned? Our intentions do not matter, our knowledge does not matter, our lives do not matter, not unless we do something with them. It won't help a single person if you spend the rest of your life in that house. It certainly won't help me." Severus stills and pivots slowly on his feet so that he swings around to face Percy once more. Percy squashes the brief flicker of triumph as Severus searches for something in his face, feeling a tangible shock as their eyes meet again. "I am not saying that I want to leave because I want to run away," Percy says with a rueful smile. "I have not been unhappy living with you, though I know you believe otherwise. But I do believe that to do nothing with our lives is not honoring those who gave their lives for us." As Percy says it out loud, he realizes that this is what has been bothering him, even on the days where he feels content, nestled softly in the solitude of Severus, home, cut off from the rest of the world. Myrtle would not be proud to know that he is spending the precious currency of his remaining lives on hiding away from the world. Landon would not respect Percy's lack of ambition, nor would Lucius. Tom would not recognize this version of Percy, and while Percy does not know if he wants to claim all of the versions of himself that Tom brought into being, he can admit to himself now that he does not want to disown all of them, either. And the version of Percy who twisted himself through time to right his wrongs, as arrogant and hot-headed and foolish as he had been, would not recognize himself either. That version of Percy was willing to take on an immortal Dark Lord with nothing more than his half-baked guesses to the future. And while Percy has castigated himself a million times for his idiocy, he had never before today recognized the bravery that had underlied his actions too. Wasn't it the most Gryffindor trait to combine bravery with idiocy, to leap without looking, to do the right thing, answers be damned? Percy had, in another life, lived his life so rigidly according to the rules he perceived in the society around him that he had lost himself to the thrall. He had ended that life for the gift to start again, and he had succeeded, in a way, despite it all. The last 11 years had not gone as smoothly as he would have hoped, and he thinks he will never be able to answer the question of whether he could have done it better had he known more of what he knew now. Bereft of the ability to travel through time again, Percy has no choice but to accept the cards in the order that they fell. The old Percy had turned against the Dark Lord at the very last minute, had fought in the Battle of Hogwarts fully intending to die, and caused his brother to die as a result of his inaction. Never again, Percy had promised fiercely to himself, but he had been betraying that version of him, and that version of Fred, and everyone else he had left behind in that world, by allowing himself to fall into the same sullen patterns, and Percy is so tired of betraying the people who care for him. "I don't want to live my life in apology," he says into the silence, shaking his head, "or mired in guilt. I've done that for 2 lifetimes, Severus, and so have you. We cannot make the same mistakes, not if we want to live our lives with honor. Tom, he never left the past behind. His soul never moved past the hurt that he felt as a boy, and we both saw the damage he wreaked on the world in his anger and his sorrow. He was never free from it, Severus, and if we are not careful, we will follow down the same path." Severus is silent for many heartbeats, his dark eyes roving over every speck of Percy's face. Percy feels his attention crawling over his skin like ants, but he forces himself to bear it silently, sensing that to look away would be to lose Severus' trust entirely. Severus allows the silence to drag on just long enough for Percy to begin to wilt, feeling that he had overstepped with no hope of walking his words back. Then he says, sharply but not unkindly, "You would make a shoddy dark lord," and Percy laughs in relief. "I would," he agrees, and then surprising them both, he sticks out his hand for a handshake, the Muggle way. "Come with me, Severus." "Why?" Severus asks, not moving to take Percy's hand, but not disdaining it either. In the question, Percy hears all of the insecurities that had underpinned his time at Hogwarts, cowering in Myrtle's bathroom, and the pain that howled in Tom's soul, and the edge that never fully left Severus' tone, even in the privacy of his own home. "Because I care for you, you incomparable idiot," Percy quotes with a small smile, and he is rewarded by an actual snort of amusement from Severus, perhaps only the second or third he has ever received. "And because I would go mad with boredom if I went myself. You will find that I am not a pleasant traveling companion," Severus warns. "Oh, neither am I," says Percy blithely. "I expect we'll hate each other by the end of the first day, but that's got to be better than hating each other at home, isn't it?" "Only time will tell, I suppose," Severus says with a long-suffering sigh, and then to Percy's great surprise, he reaches out to grasp Percy's hand. "You are sure that you wish to turn your back on this, on Hogwarts?" "Perhaps not forever," Percy admits over the shock of Severus, hand in his, strangely warm despite the cool air nipping at their heels. "But if I do return to Hogwarts, it will be because I want to, not because I have to, or I feel I have no other option." "Only you would make selfishness sound admirable," grumbles Severus. But before Percy can take offense, Severus shakes his hand and then releases it, as binding as any of the other vows that Percy had made. As Severus and Percy turn toward the gates and begin walking toward Hogsmeade, Percy feels a feeling begin to grow within his breast, at first smoldering within his body, and then spreading throughout his veins, thrumming in time with his heartbeat. At first he mistakes it for his magic, but of course he cannot change his circumstance so easily. It is not happiness, at least not yet. There is much that he feels must occur before he will feel the elusive happiness that he dimly remembers from an earlier time settling around his shoulders like a warm cloak. Perhaps there will first be Bill's wedding, with Severus as Percy's unexpected guest, or Ron and Ginny's graduation from Hogwarts. Perhaps they will go to France and Percy will suffer through Severus, knowing lectures on the quality of fine wines, or even further afield to lands that even Tom never visited, and they will have to navigate the confusing logistics of Muggle transportation and lodging. First, they must argue with each other and learn to travel together and discover new sights and build toward a new friendship. Or perhaps they will hate traveling and feel the stirrings of homesickness calling them home. Percy cannot say, but he feels that they have more than a brief walk to Hogsmeade before he would write to McGonagall. Perhaps by then he will begin to call her Minerva, as Severus does, and tell her that he has found happiness. It is not contentment, either, or at least it is not the type of contentment that has at times made Severus' house feel like a home. As Percy walks with Severus through Hogsmeade and sees the village, as gleaming and pretty and comfortable as it looked during his first return trip in this new lifetime, Percy feels the warmth of that contentment curl up and purr on his shoulder, as if to prompt him to move beyond it. "Shall we?" Severus asks at the apparition point, turning to face Percy and extending his arm for the apparition. Part of Percy wants to turn and look back at Hogwarts, to see once again the castle and its grounds and the great lakes, the leafy boughs of the forbidden forest and the gleaming frost-covered snapdragons, and think of Myrtle and Penny and Landon and Tom. But a greater part of him has been taken over by this strange, new feeling flooding his body, and so he looks only at Severus and smiles. "Let's go," Percy says, and as Severus whisks them away, he thinks dizzily to himself that perhaps what he is feeling is hope, or something akin to it. Hope that in this third life Percy will finally find the answers to some of the questions that plagued him through his first two attempts. Hope that he will once again feel strong and powerful, even without his magic, even with his half-healed soul that he may never walk physically through again. Hope that he will learn to live with honor, that he will become a man that he would be proud to know, that he will learn to choose and have conviction in his choices, and that he will be free in a way that he never could have imagined for himself. First steps first, and then the second, Percy thinks to himself, and unbidden, a smile curls the corner of his lips, and his eyes glint behind his glasses as the idea fills him once again with excitement. He had wished to be free for a long time, free from the burdens of his hindsight and the pain of his choices, and that freedom now feels within reach, blazing in the palms of his hands, a power thrumming throughout his veins, waiting for him to step forward and claim it. And as he leaves Hogwarts behind him, he takes the first step toward the rest of his life, that strange, unlived future, that endless sea of possibility, and deep inside him, something flickers into existence and begins to burn steadily. Finn,